Introduction to John Quincy Adams' Early Life ****. In the quiet halls of Quincy, Massachusetts, on July 11, 1767, a child was born who would come to carry the weight of a nation's future on his shoulders. John Quincy Adams, the first child of John and Abigail Adams, entered a world already in motion, an era of revolution, transformation, and the birth of a new nation. From his first breath, the expectations upon him were immense. His father, a passionate advocate for American independence, had already begun shaping the destiny of the fledgling United States. John Quincy's journey would be one of both privilege and struggle, a battle between destiny and self-determination. Raised amidst the political fervor of the American Revolution, John Quincy's early years were marked not by the carefree innocence of childhood, but by a front-row seat to history. At the age of 10, he accompanied his father, then the U.S. ambassador to France, to the courts of Europe. These travels became the crucible in which his future was forged. In Paris, he learned not only from books but from the finest minds of the time, witnessing firsthand the complex dance of diplomacy and governance. His father, always busy with political matters, took little time to nurture John Quincy's emotions, leaving the boy to his thoughts, ambitions, and constant questioning of his place in the world. John Quincy was no ordinary child. Even in his youth, he was an intellectual prodigy, with a thirst for knowledge that surpassed his years. Fluent in French, Dutch, and Latin by his teenage years, he devoured the works of philosophers and statesmen, refining his own views on justice, freedom, and the role of America in the world. But with this vast intellectual gift came a burden. While his father's name became synonymous with the birth of the nation, John Quincy was often cast into the shadow of his father's larger-than-life legacy. The young boy, already keenly aware of his father's towering presence, struggled to carve out an identity of his own. The real conflict that would define John Quincy's life was not external, but internal. He found himself torn between the intense expectations placed on him as the son of a revolutionary hero and the desire to forge his own path. His early years were a mix of admiration and resentment, pride and frustration. His father's shadow loomed large, casting a long line of expectations that John Quincy could neither escape nor fully embrace. As a young man, he faced not only the challenge of living up to his father's greatness but also the relentless pull of ambition, always yearning to prove himself as more than just John Adams' son. By the time he returned to America, having spent most of his adolescence in Europe, John Quincy found himself at a crossroad. Though still young, he was already a seasoned traveler, a diplomat in his own right. But with every accomplishment, there was a gnawing feeling of being overshadowed by the towering figures of his father's legacy. It was clear that John Quincy's journey would not be simple. It would be one of constant tension between the weight of heritage and the pursuit of a personal destiny. And so, the stage was set for a life unlike any other, a life that would see triumphs and failures, joys and sacrifices, but always the pursuit of a higher calling. The story of John Quincy Adams was just beginning, and the challenges ahead would shape him into a man who would redefine leadership in America. Adams' diplomatic career and the path to public life. At the age of 14, John Quincy Adams was thrust into the heart of international diplomacy, a world where decisions were made in the silent spaces between words, where the fate of nations rested on the skills of those who could wield influence without force. When his father was appointed as the U.S. ambassador to France in 1778, John Quincy accompanied him, setting the stage for a career defined by the delicate art of negotiation. His first brush with diplomacy came as a young teenager in the courts of Europe, where he saw the principles of freedom and democracy take on a global context, far beyond the borders of America. His first significant diplomatic assignment came in 1794, when he was appointed as the U.S. Minister to the Netherlands. At the age of 27, John Quincy Adams had already begun carving out a reputation as a sharp and insightful negotiator. His work in Europe was exemplary, and he navigated the tense politics of the time with a blend of quiet determination and intellectual rigor. Yet, his success was not merely a matter of foreign policy. It was about understanding the larger context, about seeing the interconnectedness of the world, and how America's role on the global stage was not yet defined. In Prussia and later in Russia, John Quincy built on this foundation, learning the intricacies of statecraft and honing his diplomatic strategies. But with every success came a new challenge: the fight to secure America's place in a world dominated by established powers like Britain and France. John Quincy's vision for the country was expansive, rooted in his belief that America was destined to rise above European conflicts and become a beacon of liberty and reason. Yet, this ambition was often at odds with the reality of international politics, where pragmatism and compromise ruled the day. The deeper he ventured into the world of diplomacy, the more John Quincy realized that his most significant battles would be fought not in foreign capitals, but in his own heart. For as much as he believed in America's exceptionalism, he was also acutely aware of its vulnerabilities. The young diplomat's commitment to strengthening America's standing in Europe was clear, but this often came at a cost. He found himself caught between two worlds: the idealism of his youthful vision for America's future and the harsh, compromising realities of political negotiation. In 1814, John Quincy Adams achieved what many considered his crowning diplomatic achievement: the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. The treaty was a remarkable success for America, preserving the nation's honor and territorial integrity. Yet, it was also a reminder of the fine line John Quincy had to walk throughout his career, balancing his personal ideals with the demands of the political landscape. But despite his diplomatic victories, a question began to gnaw at him: what would become of his legacy? He had achieved much, but the shadow of his father still loomed large, and his desire to be recognized as more than just a diplomatic tool of his father's ambitions remained unfulfilled. His contributions to American foreign policy were undeniable, but John Quincy Adams knew that to truly shape his legacy, he would need to venture beyond Europe's courts and into the heart of American politics. And so, as his diplomatic career reached its zenith, John Quincy began contemplating the next phase of his life, a phase that would lead him to the White House, where his true test awaited. But first, he had to reconcile the man he had become with the legacy that had always defined him. The presidency and the struggles of leadership. In 1825, John Quincy Adams ascended to the presidency of the United States, a position he had long dreamed of, but one fraught with challenges that threatened to overshadow his vision. The election of 1824, a bitter contest marred by accusations of a corrupt bargain, had not only divided the nation but also set the stage for a presidency that would be defined by political strife rather than unity. Adams had won the office despite Andrew Jackson's commanding lead in the popular vote and electoral college. His presidency, from its very beginning, was marked by skepticism and division. Adams had always been a man of lofty ideals. His vision for America was one of progress and enlightenment, with a strong emphasis on education, infrastructure, and scientific advancement. He proposed a national university, internal improvements such as roads and canals, and even a national observatory. His was a forward-thinking, intellectual agenda that aimed to transform America into a modern nation, fully capable of competing on the world stage. Yet, the country was not ready for such ambitious goals. The Jacksonian faction, which would soon grow into the Democratic Party, viewed his proposals as elitist and unnecessary. They saw him as a man out of touch with the common people, someone too ensnared in intellectualism and not in tune with the populist spirit that was beginning to sweep across America. Adams' presidency became a constant struggle against opposition both from within his own party and from the rising tide of Jacksonian democracy. His attempts to implement his plans were thwarted time and again by a Congress that refused to cooperate. The political climate of the time was increasingly polarized, and Adams found himself isolated, unable to build the alliances necessary to pass his ambitious reforms. Worse, his political opponents painted him as an out-of-touch aristocrat, despite his deep belief in the Republican values his father had championed. At the heart of Adams' struggle was not merely the resistance from his opponents, but an inner conflict, a sense of frustration and self-doubt that had lingered since his youth. Throughout his career, he had always been seen as John Adams' son, the diplomatic heir, the intellectual. But now, as president, he realized how little he was able to shape the immediate future of the nation according to his ideals. Each day in the White House was a reminder of how difficult it was to align his vision with the political reality he faced. The people, many of whom had voted for Jackson in overwhelming numbers, did not see him as their champion. They saw a man who was part of the old guard, disconnected from the burgeoning spirit of democracy. And yet Adams pressed on. He refused to let go of his principles, even as the political tides worked against him. He used his presidency not to advance personal glory, but to lay the groundwork for future generations, believing that true leadership often required sacrifice. Despite